So for the final session this afternoon, we've got certainly in the shape of Roger Bolton, somebody whose certainly voice will be very well known to many of you, and probably even his face at times. To introduce the chair is Richard Ayre. We've been very lucky with the chairs that we've had in these sessions. Richard is another uniquely qualified broadcaster with experience both in the broadcasting side, the regulatory side, and the government side. News within the BBC, editorial policy in the BBC, at a time at Ofcom, and a period as a trustee of the BBC as well. So, Richard, over to you to get the session going.
Thanks very much, Colin. And, well, good afternoon. We've got, as your guest today, one of the towering figures of broadcast journalism over the last 50 or more years. Roger was...
You've not lost your gift for sarcasm, have you?
Editor of the Tonight programme, not, I think, the Cliff Mitchellmore version.
No, we'd pass by.
Not that old. Editor of Panorama, editor of Nationwide, editor of This Week, presenter of a range of programmes, the Sunday programme on Radio 4, presenter of Channel 4's Right to Reply, presenter of a programme, can't remember what it was called, it was on the air till recently with you, Feedback, that's it. Roger was also the guy who led the BBC's first tentative attempts to level up from BBC Manchester. Roger and the teams that have worked for and with him have earned innumerable industry awards, public plaudits, political criticism, especially from the late Mrs. Thatcher, and Roger is sometimes credited as having brought down the Independent Broadcasting Authority and ended the licence for Thames Television. So, we'll talk about all of those things, but let's not start at the beginning, but at the end. So you can get this off your chest, Roger, because for the last 15 years, I've been an intermittent guest on the Feedback programme, and every time Roger has recorded an interview with me, as soon as they stop recording, I say, when are you going to give up this programme and let someone like me earn an honest buck and take over? And then, blow me, 3 months ago, I turn on my radio and hear this guy saying he's been sacked, and that he doesn't really want to go. So tell us the truth. What happened? Why did you go? Why did the BBC get rid of you? What had you done, Roger?
Well, you've departed for your normally immaculate standards of journalism. It's a perfectly reasonable decision of the BBC to take. I mean, I'd done the thing for 23 years. I'd have liked to have gone on a bit longer, wouldn't we all the time? So it's a perfectly reasonable decision to take. And I have no bitterness, no complaints. However, there's always a but. It did give me an opportunity to vent in the last programme and so on about the issues I cared about in terms of accountability. And the other thing is, as anybody who's worked for the BBC will know, they don't handle these things very well. In fact, they are inept. In fact, they're incompetent and frequently insensitive. And all they had to do was, in my case, was, Roger, great, you've done it for a long time, come and have a drink with 1 or 2 commissioning editors, 15 minutes max, maybe 20 minutes. Thank you very much. Any more ideas you've got, we'll listen, goodbye, thank you. But at the BBC, as long as I remember it, and I've been in it was in it for over 50 odd years, whatever, or contacted with it, can't do this. They can't do it face to face. They can't manage talent. It's very bizarre. So I have a slight anger about the way it was done, but no anger at all about the fact it's been done. And I'm delighted that Andrea Catherwood is presenting it. She's a really good choice. She's a really strong, tough, independent journalist, and I think she'll do it very well.
But you are, of course, now in competition with her because you have launched your own podcast doing the same thing. What's it called? Remind us.
Roger Bolton's Beebwatch. But, I mean, that podcast are only going to have, you hope to have influence. They maybe have 1,300, 1,500 people will listen to it at some point, and you hope that it might impact upon the debate. But you compare something with Feedback with if you continue, repeats and other things. You know, it has about, almost 1 million listeners. That's a vast difference. But I wanted to speak out at the end because I had a mounting frustration, or have had throughout. And I think it's the frustration you only get with a member of your family, you know, where I regard myself as a critical friend of the BBC. In a way, I feel I'm a child of the organisation. And when they don't behave as you think they should behave, you get very cross with them.
So remember the name Roger Bolton's Beebwatch,
Thank you for your understanding.
available on all reputable podcast providers. Is it on BBC Sounds by any chance?
It is not. Just very briefly, a couple of things which drove me around the bend at the BBC. One is the BBC's increasingly in the last few years to have the corporate press office determine whether people appeared on the programme or not. It shouldn't be any of their business. It should be automatically built into the deal over the licence fee that the BBC is answerable in all its forms. After all, you own it. It should be accountable. And, you know, if you were if you have shares in a company, a publicly quoted company, at least they'll have an annual general meeting. You can go down there. You can ask a question, or you can put something. What do you do with the BBC? You pay for it. Do you honestly think you're accountable? We heard Rodri this morning, and he was maybe future Director General, a very persuasive advocate. But actually, it was the old BBC line, which is, we will decide what's good for you. We will then tell you what we've decided, and you will support us. You should support us. Well, come on, that's not accountability as I understand it. And the other thing, so apart from that problem of general accountability, the idea was so often when they weren't putting up people to come on the programme, we don't think it's the right time. And that's a fundamental misunderstanding. The right time is when the audience wants to ask the question, not when the BBC wants to answer it. But you're stuck with this, I understand the BBC feels it all the time, it's under great pressure and attack, and we don't want to give up hostages to fortune. But it doesn't realise its greatest strength is its audience. And if you want the audience to fight for you, you've got to feel that you listen to them, and not listen after you've made a decision. Listen sometimes when you're in the process of making a decision. So I enjoyed the opportunity of saying that at the end, sorry.
It's bizarre, really. I'm quite pleased that the BBC declined to take part in most of your latter programmes, because it gave me the opportunity of doing so. I used to get calls from Roger saying, BBC have turned me down again, will you come and talk? Sadly, I didn't get paid. Why was I not paid for that?
Well, I'll tell you what I got paid. I got paid £1,000 for doing the show. That's, 2 days' work and listening to things. The budget for a Radio 4 programme, like Feedback, is roughly £5,000 per edition. Now, you work the staffing costs and work everything out, and that's why I didn't get paid. And
Okay, let's go back. Let's go back just half a century. Panorama, under Roger's stewardship, Panorama did a series of fantastic programmes, so we're not going to talk about those. But it also went to Carrickmore. Carrickmore is a little village just across the border inside Northern Ireland. And in 1979, Roger, perhaps having inside knowledge, because we now know that the British government at the time was talking through an intermediary at that time to the IRA. However, Roger had the foresight to send a team to Dublin to start making a programme, Jeremy Paxman and a producer and a crew, a programme about the history of the IRA, trying to find out how flexible the IRA, the modern IRA, might be about the idea of political change. They got a phone call, the producer got a phone call in the hotel in Dublin from someone, according to Wikipedia, an anonymous phone call, saying, if you come to Carrickmore tomorrow morning at a set time, you'll see something interesting. And if you believe the BBC's version at the time, the producer and camera crew then went to Carrickmore, and at the set time they arrived in the village, and shortly after they arrived, a number of men wearing balaclava helmets came out onto the streets with automatic weapons and started stopping the traffic, quizzing drivers, parading up and down the road, blocking the road. All the while, the normal folk of Carrickmore went about their daily business. They were shopping, they were taking their kids to school with these IRA men amongst them. The BBC filmed for a while. If you believe the story, the BBC didn't talk to any of the IRA people, certainly didn't interview them, and after a while, having filmed for a few minutes, the BBC then headed back south an hour and a half to Dublin. Nobody knew this had happened for some days. Somebody at the high levels in BBC Northern Ireland was told about it, but the boss of BBC Northern Ireland wasn't told about it. And almost 2 weeks later, he found himself at what must have been a really ghastly dinner party in London, where somebody in government said to him, "I hear your chaps have been filming with the IRA in Carrickmore." The controller of BBC Northern Ireland said, "Rubbish, nonsense, wouldn't do anything like that." Then had the wisdom to make a phone call back to base to discover that it had indeed happened, and the controller of Northern Ireland hit the roof. It didn't hit the roof as hard as Margaret Thatcher did when she was said by a cabinet colleague to have gone scatty in cabinet, condemning the BBC. And James Callaghan, then leader of the opposition, said that the BBC had set out deliberately to manufacture the news. William Whitelaw, the Home Secretary, summoned the BBC's chairman at the time and said, "Something must be done, you must make an example of them." Roger Bolton was sacked as editor of Panorama. A few days later, after the BBC's journalists had protested, Roger Bolton was unsacked as the editor of Panorama and resumed his role. The film never went out, or at least never went out for about 20 years or so. Now is the time you can safely tell us the truth. What happened? Why did you go to Carrickmore? Did you really go to Carrickmore not knowing what was going to happen? Were you being used by the IRA? Roger, your chance.
I never went to Carrickmore. It's a long story. I mean, I'll try and tell it in 3 gobbets. The first gobbet is why try and make the programme. And by the time we're there, in about 1979, the troubles have been going on. Well, by some, if you'd start them at 68, you'd say them for 11 years. You could start a year later, maybe. The troubles have been going on. Terrible things happening. I'd been backwards and forwards there quite a lot. And what was frustrating about the coverage was essentially we were looking at the results of what was wrong rather than what was wrong. In other words, we were attracted by violence and by bombs. We were effectively being summoned by the paramilitaries. They committed something dreadful. We went and reported. I should say at this point, the people who were doing the real work and the real heroes were in the Northern Ireland newsroom day by day, and they included this man. But we were coming from the mainland. And we had a situation in the House of Commons where it wasn't just Mr. and Mrs. Thatcher. You should remember Roy Mason, just before Mrs. Thatcher came to power, as Northern Ireland Secretary, who was as Thatcherite in these matters as you could imagine. There was a front bench consensus not to talk about this issue. Lots of opinion polls in the country suggesting that a significant number of people in the country, maybe a majority, maybe not, but quite close to it, thought that Ireland perhaps should be united. And you had the situation on the ground. I thought the role of Panorama was to try and examine what was going on in the sense of what were the IRA, why were they able to continue to operate in the way they could, what were they really about, were they a Marxist organization, what sort of Ireland did they want, how come they could manage to be both Marxist as they were and could get support from right-wing Americans, etc., etc. After 10 years at least, a long, cool look at what this organization was, what it wanted and whether it was, and how it was supported was necessary. And the key thing that made me want to do it was to go to a briefing by a man called Brigadier Glover, you will probably remember him, head of intelligence in Northern Ireland, as one off-the-record briefing, saying, we can't beat the IRA. The IRA can't beat us. They only need a very small number of people to operate and be an irritant, given, if not the support of a significant section of the population, certainly the tolerance. So there's got to be a political solution. So you have intelligence, you have all of these people saying there's got to be a solution, and there's no debate in the House of Commons, and the political parties won't have anything to discuss this. And Mrs. Thatcher saying this is simply a matter of criminality. So it seemed to me the role of something like Panorama is to go and report. I did. So what I authorized the team to do, part 1, was to look at the history of up to the point that the officials and the provisionals had separated. They went a bit further than that, and they went and filmed at Carrickmore. But the important thing is, there are 2 things about Carrickmore. One is no film was ever transmitted. Secondly, there were really difficult editorial decisions to be made about whether you would transmit the material or not. The argument for transmitting it would be this. The IRA were able to occupy a village, walk up and down with guns, a village 10 miles from the nearest police station, and they'd done it before. So actually, this is a reality. The British government on the ground does not control all Northern Ireland. The argument against this is a setup for the BBC. I think it probably was a setup of the BBC because what happened was our team went in Dublin, talked to Sinn Féin, asked about what they were doing. Why should we believe you? Get a call immediately afterwards at their hotel. There's obviously Sinn Féin, Ayre, deciding this might be an opportunity to get the BBC to witness what they're probably going to do anyway, but they might not have done on that day. Covered by others, by the way, but it's a separate matter. The key question is, or for me was, yes, you go, yes, you find out what's happening, but you're like a print journalist who brings back his notebook. There's one thing, which is the collection of information. The second question is whether you broadcast it and how you broadcast it and so on. Well, we never got to the second point. So that's...
Let me interrupt you. Okay. The BBC spokesman at the time, when the stuff hit the fan, said the BBC had gone to Carrickmore, quote, as a normal journalistic response to an anonymous phone call. Are you really saying that your people getting an anonymous phone call, not knowing who it was from, what it was for, just saying, come to a place in what was then known by hack journalists as bandit country, are you really saying that the normal journalistic response is just to go? What if there'd been a bomb set off as they arrived for them to film? What if they'd taken some British soldiers or RUC men and women hostage for Panorama to film? Are you really saying that a normal journalistic response, when someone just phones you out of the blue and says, hi, you don't know me, I'm Seamus, come to Carrickmore tomorrow at 11, is it normal just to go with your film crew?
Well, let me phrase it another way. Would you not go for any tip-off? I've just said that they had a pretty good idea. They'd been to talk to Sinn Féin. As they'd been to other parties, they'd explained what we were trying to do. They did want a representative from Sinn Féin. We're not then banned, that became subsequently. And then they got a call afterwards, of course. Now, how honest they are with me, my producer report, I'm not entirely sure, but obviously they knew it was connected with that. But of course, you're absolutely right. If you go in those circumstances and something happens and you witness it, you have to ask yourself, have I caused this? I was only consulted afterwards, by the way. I didn't know until it happened at the time. But I don't think they caused it. And I know they didn't cause it in this sense, that the IRA was doing this sort of thing relatively frequently. The year before, I'd been caught, almost caught, with an army officer. I was driving, he was in the passenger seat. We were going through that, not far from there, actually, and the IRA mounted a roadblock, and he spotted it quickly, and we turned around. These roadblocks were happening. That's not a surprise. Was it done for us? Perhaps it was on this occasion. Should it have been transmitted? We didn't have the chance to make up our minds.
However, you say it wasn't transmitted. I think what you just said suggests what must surely be the case, that if it hadn't leaked, if it hadn't become cause of a major political row for the BBC, you'd have gone on and made the programme about the IRA perfectly properly. You'd have used that, wouldn't you? Wouldn't you have used that footage to illustrate how they're able to operate on the streets of the United Kingdom without interference?
I would probably have used it, but I would have spelt out the circumstances in which it was gathered. Just as, you know, you were handed stuff by ETA from Spain, terrorist organization, what it was up to, you have think very hard. Do you use it? Actually, there's an additional set of problems with that. You weren't there when the material was shot. How do you know, etc.? You're measuring it up against a number of difficult issues, but I think in the end I would have probably put it out, but with a warning, but in a wider context. You see, I think, I'd say just a couple of other things. The reason it got really into difficulty was the BBC had Mrs. Thatcher had just come to power. In the run-up to the election, her closest friend, Ayre, who was, she depended absolutely on in terms of Northern Ireland, had been assassinated, blown up, as it happened not by the IRA, but by another Republican group, the INLA. She had no experience of Northern Ireland. Remember, she's going to be, from the moment she becomes Prime Minister, or her children are under threat. She's later on, as we know, in 1980, blown up herself. She then loses her principal private secretary later on, Ian Gow. That's afterwards, but there's no reason why you would expect Mrs. Thatcher to be sympathetic or to understand these issues. You would expect it of a lot of people around her. But what happened and she didn't like the BBC, what happened at this event was the BBC had exceeded its borrowing powers. And the BBC board, not in my view, but I'm prejudiced, the greatest collection of broadcasting minds, were negotiating with the government in a difficult situation. They wanted a licence fee increase. They were dealing with the charter issues. They just think they're getting somewhere with a sympathetic William Whitelaw behind them, one or two others. And these bloody idiots in Panorama go and bloody well film in Northern Ireland. And then the BBC governors are thinking, what do we do? What do we do? Oh, well, and then someone says, well, we don't think the controller of Northern Ireland should have been concerned, and he wasn't. We can harden up on that consultation issue, and therefore we can sack the editor of Panorama because of that. And the government, I went into the disciplinary interview, to be sacked. Before I'd gone in there, Bernard Ingham had been told I had been sacked. Bernard Ingham being the government. Anyway, the BBC screwed up the whole process.
And tell us briefly the conversation when you were sacked. What did they say you were being sacked for?
It was failure. Well, one of the interesting things here, being the BBC, of course, is there was never a formal charge. I wasn't allowed to see the report on what had happened. I wasn't allowed to see any evidence about how many. It was that there was a standing instruction, I don't know what the number was, that when events in Northern Ireland, when people were covering controversial events in Northern Ireland, the controller of Northern Ireland had to be consulted. This, in a way, goes back to the time when the Protestant ascendancy, shall we say, controlled Northern Ireland and didn't like people like Alan Wicker and others coming there. But anyway, it was there. I had consulted the Director of News and Current Affairs, for whom I'd written a paper and who had actually encouraged me to make the programme, the head of programmes Northern Ireland, the news editor of Northern Ireland. Now, the controller had just been appointed, didn't know. I don't want to go into the internal politics.
But I'll add a bit of the internal politics because I was in the Belfast, and the head of programmes in Northern Ireland was consulted, or at least informed, and he did not tell his direct boss, the controller, Jimmy Hawthorne. Why did he not tell him? I think because he thought he was not competent to handle these issues, and he was probably right.
What Jimmy then did, Jimmy Hawthorne, was send an open TEDx, which got to everybody, saying how outrageous I was because we'd done another programme and so on. But I think what it illustrates, I would say we had, if I look back on what I failed to do, which is a good thing to do, when I had the privilege of being in a very important positions, I failed to get a proper series of programmes which tried to understand and take a long look at the support for the Republican movement. I failed to properly ensure people could examine the contradictions within it. We failed to confront Sinn Féin IRA with the obvious question, which is, why on earth should people in the north of Ireland with a very distinct set of identity different from yours and rather more heavily armed than you, agree peaceably to be part of some larger, as it happened, federal Ireland built on a Marxist model? But we never got to that point because Mrs. Thatcher essentially wanted it treated as a criminal issue, and the BBC governors were worried about the future of the BBC.
Roger, your determination to report across a range of programmes you made for the BBC and for Thames Television, your determination to report and to understand events in Ireland, North and South, is second to none other than your reporting colleague Peter Taylor.
He's out.
The two of you share,
and John Ware did exceptional work too.
The two of you particularly share those honours. However, we'll move on, except to say, I asked you what they said to you when they sacked you. Much more interesting is, what did they say to you the day they unsacked you?
Well, the day they sacked me, they said, I think, Roger, it would be a very good idea for you to spend a period, because you haven't properly understood the managerial role in the BBC. It would be very good for you to spend a time in Secretariat. And after a while, the managing director of television may agree to you returning. That's what they said.
You moved.
I just say, I'm obsessive about this. I think that problem that I failed to do in Ireland, we failed to do about Brexit. And this is because I believe the BBC, at times of controversy, retreats to a position where it looks at what the argument is in Parliament and says, if it's that and it's that, we'll represent that, and that's our duty done. So in terms of Brexit, what we did not do was the second part of the argument. The first part of the argument is, should we consider leaving Europe? The second part of the argument is, what are we leaving for? Is it likely to be better? Who are the people who are pushing for Brexit? What do they want? There are a whole range of other issues. That programme about Britain after Brexit that the BBC should have made, it didn't make, because it was dangerous and controversial. But in not doing that, it did a disservice to the public. And I think that thread is throughout the BBC's coverage, particularly when it's under pressure on the licence fee. In the end, you retreat and you report the argument as it is conducted in Parliament. That sounds proper, but it leaves vast areas, I think, where the public deserves to be informed and often isn't.
We've not colluded in what questions I would ask or how Roger would answer them, except he did say, as we came in, that whatever I asked him, he would bring it round to Brexit. Well done, old boy, well done. Let's move on from Panorama to Nationwide. I had a particular interest in your editorship of Nationwide because on a very few and invariably catastrophic occasions, I was presenting the Northern Ireland opt-out to Nationwide. And amongst the journalists in Northern Ireland, you had a reputation of being the serious editor of Nationwide, who was making it a serious programme and no more skateboarding ducks. Does anyone remember skateboarding ducks?
You're unfair at the skateboarding duck. I did look, when I took over the programme, I did look at it. It was funny.
But you didn't do it again. But you did have a more clear, it seemed to me at the time, a more clear determination to report serious current events and not simply magazine current events.
Nationwide is a bit of a mess, or my role in it was a bit of a mess, and I was the last editor, so some people I think I was the undertaker. It's a complex story, but basically, Nationwide, when it was first devised, bridged that gap between not quite the toddler's truce that used to exist, but between 6 and 7. And its basic strength and its real strength was that it could draw upon all the different regions of the BBC and national regions. And in a way, when there'd be terrible storms and things, it could be a unifying factor, and when not, it could just actually inform you. It began to run out of steam, like these all things do, and I think, to be honest, that the people make the programme tried to take the punters for granted. You know, there's a moment where people... So it needed a bit of rebooting, but it had been decided by the BBC that actually they were going to get rid of Nationwide. They were going to reorganise the early evening, and I was sat in a meeting with Alistair Milne and others where they said it would happen a year after I took over, and there would be a news and current affairs programme from 6 to 6:30, and then for the first time putting both together, and then there'd be the regional opt-outs. And my job was to harden up, which I wanted to do Nationwide in preparation for it ceasing to exist and another programme existing in its place. Well, what happened was in the end that Alistair Milne, a bad Director General, good man in many ways, bad Director General, couldn't carry people with him or couldn't enforce his will. Either way, it didn't happen. And so we're up the river without a paddle, and I'd persuaded David Dimbleby to come across. So you're right to say I wanted to harden it up. But what I did feel strongly about, and where I think the One Show is a disgrace and a tragedy, actually, is that the great BBC strength still is its regions. And in Nationwide, reinvented, it has a perfect vehicle there. And it would strengthen regional journalism, which is in there. And the BBC doesn't see that. And fundamentally doesn't see it because it still remains a desperately metropolitan organisation. So I really think, and it would just work on someone else. So I'm guilty, in many ways, for not pushing that case harder. And maybe I'm guilty of overestimating the interest of a 6 o'clock audience in the failure of a Russian grain harvest, which was one of the charges put to me. But I did believe that. I think it's a programme. One of the things I most admire, do you remember when, in terms of comedy, was when in the first series of that wonderful comedy with David Jason, The East End, what's it called?
Only Fools and Horses.
Only Fools and Horses, the grandfather died. So you had a decision then, what do you do? And they had the courage to have the first episode of the second series as being the funeral. In other words, they saw the strength of the programme and had the courage to make changes in time. The BBC, in my view, failed to see the strength of Nationwide and didn't make the necessary changes. And I think when you look at the One Show today and you think what the BBC could now offer that nobody else offers in terms of a regional, national regional programme that pulls things together, that's it. So I look on that as a failure, actually.
And when the BBC did then, after you'd left, replace Nationwide, it did so with a programme which was so catastrophically awful. I can't even remember what it was called.
60 Minutes.
60 Minutes. Ah, yes, it felt like
Well, it
90.
wasn't different. It pretended to be something, and it wasn't. It actually was a programme which tried to hold the air while the BBC management tried to get its act together and reorganise things.
However, by that time,
Right, yeah.
you had very sensibly gone to Thames Television, where...
No, I was fired from the BBC.
yes, but you were fired from the BBC, but you went to Thames, didn't you?
Yeah, I didn't want to leave the BBC.
No, all right, but you went. You went
Yes,
to Thames.
I went
Let's
to Thames,
agree,
yeah.
you
I
went
was
to
very
Thames,
grateful that
okay?
Thames picked me up. Yeah.
And one of the programmes you will be most remembered for, rightly so for all sorts of reasons, is, you know which one I'm going to say, is Death on the Rock. So this was in 1988.
8.
3 members of the IRA were shot dead by members of the SAS on Gibraltar, as the members of the IRA were allegedly preparing to plant a bomb, though they had not, it emerged later, actually planted the bomb yet. Roger very rapidly sent out a crew to, under Julian Mannion as the reporter, to Gibraltar. They interviewed as many eyewitnesses as they could find, all of whom, with different perspectives and different stories, but not contradictory stories, testified that they had heard no warning shouts from the undercover SAS people, and variously claimed that the IRA, 2 men and 1 woman, had been shot in the back or shot when they were lying down, having surrendered. The programme went out. It won awards. The British government, it's fair to say, were thermonuclear. Tried to stop the programme going out. Tried to instruct the Independent Broadcasting Authority to ban it. The IBA stood their ground. The programme went out. Subsequently, at the inquest in Gibraltar, one of the people interviewed by your team withdrew his testimony, withdrew the statement that he'd made to Julian Mannion. The others gave consistent testimony, but it threw some doubt upon the accuracy of the programme, and therefore Thames Television commissioned a High Court barrister, distinguished barrister Richard Rampton, and a Tory peer, Lord what's his name, Windlesham, to investigate. And their report, after some months, largely cleared the programme, not well, in interesting terms, and said that it had rightly examined one possibility of why and how.
No, it didn't say that. I'll tell you what it said.
Okay.
What its criticisms were that the guy who gave evidence, who withdrew his evidence, even though the coroner said it contained information that they'd found out for the first time, that we didn't make clear enough the circumstances in which we got that. It was a written form. The second thing of the, I think, 4 witnesses we talked to, none of whom had heard or seen any challenge by the British soldiers. They said 2 of them might not have been able to hear anyway because they were standing on a curbside in the road and the noise might have stopped them. However, the soldiers themselves, when interviewed, we assume it was them at the inquest, admitted that they didn't know whether they'd given warnings or either. But those were the 2 criticisms. The rest they said some rather nice things. But I think the thing, why do we make it? Well, when I first heard what had happened in Gibraltar, I thought, well, there's a pattern here. There's nothing for us to do in this week. What tends to happen is when the IRA meets the SES in an operation the IRA is carrying out, not many people survive. And in a way, the IRA themselves regard this as just a matter of war. And I forget the name of the place, but not long before there'd been a similar incident. So I said, what is there to do? The following, and there were briefings, you'd have heard them on Today programme, saying the IRA were armed, they'd put a bomb in their car, they even described the nature of the bomb. Well, open and shut case, why bother what there is for it to? Although, back of your mind, there are allegations, shoot to kill is going on in Northern Ireland, but, it's never been proven. But anyway, and then Geoffrey Howe stands up on Monday afternoon in the House of Commons and says there wasn't a bomb in the car, and the IRA members were unarmed, and then the roof came off. So you knew, I knew, because being Northern Ireland, whatever, that particularly as one of the people involved was a woman, they'd be, she'd be there like the Virgin Mary painted on a gable end. The propaganda war would take off. So it seemed to be an absolutely proper thing to say what happened. And, I confessed to the end, I don't know what happened. I do know what didn't happen, and what didn't happen is what the British government said happened. But from the beginning, and perhaps, we went to find as many witnesses as possible. We got as many as possible. We couldn't find anybody who stood up the government's position. I kept going, I think I went twice, 3 times to the MOD, saying, can you give me an on-the-record interview? Can you give me an off-the-record interview? Nope. I kept them informed throughout the program what we were doing, expecting they would do the old trick of wait until the end to know exactly what's in the program, and then the very last moment, give us an interview, and at such a length that we'd have to cut the other program back. That didn't happen. I then was worried, obviously, I became convinced, it is the case, the IRA were planning what we would call legitimately an atrocity. Because if the bomb, which they intended to plant, but they hadn't planted, it was a rehearsal, had been placed where it was, they would have hit, yes, of course, soldiers and bandsmen, no question. Others who'd come along to watch would have been killed, blown up, maimed, whatever. This would have been an atrocity. So on the one hand, we're doing that, but outlining what happened, but on the other hand, I wanted to show what the IRA were intending. I went to the MOD and asked them, we want to blow up a car with the same amount of gelignite that we think, or you say, was planned ultimately to be used. We needed their permission because no way. So in the end, what I did was to go to Northern Ireland and we interviewed, we didn't interview, the wife of a headmaster who had been caught in an earlier blast and who couldn't speak and was in a very bad way, because it was important to make clear that there was no question about what the IRA intended, but there's equally no question the government's account about what they knew. I could go into massive other details about why I don't believe the government's account, but I still don't know what happened. But I went to see Willie Whitelaw, who was then, afterwards, who I'd known because he was MP for Penrith, afterwards, about a year later when I was writing something, and I talked to him about it, and he said, look, I can't talk about this, but just look at who we sent. If you want to capture these people, and then he stopped. You don't put the SAS in. And I don't blame the SAS. I mean, put yourself in the SAS shoes. I think they were probably briefed that the IRA members were armed. They may well have been briefed that they had a bomb or something, I don't know. If you're going to tackle people who you know are killers, and you maybe have been briefed that they're armed or whatever, you probably don't ask, excuse me,
Roger, you're still passionate about this.
Sorry.
No, not at all. By the time that program went out, you were the opposition, as far as I was concerned. I remember thinking, first of all, that it was a brilliant program, and I was ashamed that the BBC hadn't made it first. It was a fantastic and courageous piece of
But the BBC made it
journalism. It did make it second. It did make it second. But being second doesn't count.
No, but I think I think, again, another scandal which is revealing about the BBC is a very good team from Spotlight in Northern Ireland who did current affairs, went to Northern Ireland, went to Gibraltar a little later than us and separately, made their own programme, came to very similar conclusions. They had a very good reporter who then went on to Channel 4 News. And they put it out in Northern Ireland, and the BBC refused to put it out on the mainland. Now, what normally happened in these circumstances, if you have a regional current affairs programme that says something as good as that, it or most of it gets transmitted in Newsnight or whatever it's available. Yeah. The BBC took the view, no. Yeah. And this reveals a truth about Northern Ireland, which again aggravated me intensely. What essentially people were worried about is what people on the mainland would think, or what Mrs. Thatcher saw. So there you have people in Northern Ireland who were suffering, brilliant, in my view, brave local journalists reporting what's happening. And the BBC and the government, to a degree, mainly the government, colliding to protect the population from some of this detail. And people like, I'm not just saying, people like Richard Ayre fought against that, but that was a tendency. And the awful truth is the English still don't care much about what happens in Northern Ireland, hence the problems about Brexit.
In the interest of...
When did we have a last
interest
history?
In
When
the
did we last
interest...
have a history of Ireland on the BBC?
We've got to move on. But in the interest of impartiality, it wouldn't be fair to leave the impression that the BBC decided not to broadcast this programme across the UK when it normally would have been. It was a regional programme, but it wasn't repeated in Great Britain, as often very good regional programmes were.
Impeccably stated, sir.
Yeah, okay. And now we're going to move on to one more issue before we take questions, and that is that you are a very unusual person in broadcast journalism, in my experience, in one respect, in that you're out as a Christian. You're a Christian, and the only other out Christian that I can recall working closely with was Martin Bashir. So I find it difficult, because I don't have a faith. I find it difficult to reconcile your commitment, absolute lifelong proven commitment to evidence-based factual journalism, how you square that with your faith-based commitment to life decisions. And I just wonder whether you'd like to square the circle.
No, but I'll try. I mean, it depends what you mean by Christian. You know, just as that I would see, the BBC is a means to an end. The end is public service broadcasting. It's a means to an end. The church is a means to an end. Yeah, I try to follow Jesus. And that's why I call myself Christian. And I'm not sure about a massive other things. But I think one of the things I most admired about is not just Christianity, and it goes to, is that that it regards every individual soul as being equally worthwhile in principle. And if you take that view, then I don't think, well, you can't do the John Stewart largest, you know, it comes down to Gibraltar, everything. Every individual matters. Every individual has been a child, etc., etc. And so I suppose to that extent that in fact affected me. The other thing is that, and it was also Malcolm Murgish affected you. Christianity makes you ask the question why, and that is the most interesting question. And so I suppose that's another thing. And when it comes to, but what you can't be a Christian journalist. You can be a journalist who might be a Christian, a journalist might be a Muslim or a Jew or whatever, but the journalism has to come first. But it is informed by who you are. But for you to show preference to anything to do with your faith would be wrong, except insofar as you regard as everybody as fundamentally equal. So when you hear appalling things said in certain circumstances about terrorists and others, you know, you think, what made them? Why are they like that? They didn't start off like that. So you want to find why. But I suppose and also the church has such an appalling record almost everywhere in many ways, but it's the man-made element. I mean, I think when I went, this is disconnected, when I went to the television festival in Edinburgh, I joined the BBC when I was 21. I think I joined it as an alternative to joining the church. I think I had an unrealistic expectation of it in terms of what it was and what it could be. And I remember my eyes being opened at the Edinburgh Television Festival to realise that colleagues in World in Action and elsewhere in ITN and whatever were doing the same job, absolutely, and were committed to the same things, and how absurd it was to suggest they weren't part of public service broadcasting. But I still believed, and I believe now, that the BBC is the best means to an end, but it's a means. But ultimately, if you take that, I don't know whether this is true about Christianity, but you think, everybody has to realize that they are, and every leader they are in temporary charge. We're all in temporary charge of whatever we are. And what are you handing on? And have you, in the end, compromised? I had a great ability to confuse public interest with my private interest for large parts of my life.
Don't we all?
But at least I try to be aware of it.
And
that was a confused answer, sorry.
If you were in two minds as to whether to get into public service broadcasting or the church, and you've just said there was much, in your view, much wrong with the churches, do you think you made the right decision?
I'd have been a rotten priest. The thing that attracted me, I realised, was the prospect of standing up in the pulpit and lecturing to people. And I think that's...
This is your opportunity, however. We must
I've lectured you enough.
We must take questions from the floor. Lady in the middle. Just beside you, that's right.
Hello, I'm Linda Rattigan. What you were saying about Brexit, would you say the same thing applies to the climate with BBC?
I'm not sure the same thing, but I think that, well, we're into impartiality, due impartiality, and this gentleman knows more than me. I think one of the key things is to, first of all, recognise your own bias, and to recognise the bias is implicit in the organisations in which you work. You know, I think people who work in the BBC inevitably are going to be more liberal than most, because if you have very powerful, strong views, you may end up working for political parties and elsewhere. So you have to recognise your inbuilt bias. You have to recognise, for example, if the majority of your producers are young people, there'll be an age bias. So the question is, first of all, look at yourself, look at the organisation, the bias, and then you look out, having looked at that, and try and look at trying to ensure you're properly impartial. But I don't think you need to be impartial about the questions you ask. You know, what happens often with a political debate, as you know, and it's happening now with the gender debate, is people try to they try to own the language, because they feel that if they can get their interpretation of language or their words used, it'll prejudice the debate in their favour. They tend to frame the debate in that way. And they also try, the focus of the debate is also focused on what is most advantageous to their position. And so this is a natural part of politics that you recognise. So I saw or thought that one of the key roles is to focus on what is not focused upon, but was it important. Now, when it comes to impartiality, it seems to me that with climate change, we've moved through a period where there was a reasonable debate to a situation where the majority, the vast majorities of who are expert in a particular field have come down to a conclusion about climate change and the very significant role of a man-made element in that. There's an argument then that debates, which should be debated about what you then do about it, but in terms of the science, I would have thought impartiality should not now require you to say the argument is open. Now, when we come to Brexit,
the vast majority of the experts in terms of economics forecast that Brexit would be disadvantageous.
yes.
But you're not saying, are you, that the BBC and other public service broadcasters didn't have a duty to be impartial in its coverage?
Yeah, due impartiality, but I think we have, on Brexit, I think, as I say to you, I think the framing of the debate. I mean, for example, the BBC, in my view, should have devoted a whole programme to the meaning of sovereignty. There was a term that was used all the time in the debate. It has an emotional resonance, and most of us haven't really thought it through about what does sovereignty mean. Does it mean, and when is shared sovereignty, a sharing, an increase of sovereignty? That was a role, as essential public educational role, in my view, the BBC should have got into, and it didn't. I think there are lots of signs it's doing more than this, but I think it's interesting now about Brexit. In the short term, and it's a relatively short term, and of course COVID is there, at least the view of the Office of Budget Responsibility and so on, is that Brexit has been extremely damaging. And you see the latest forecasts show that of all the OECD countries, we're going to be the only ones in recession and elsewhere, and I don't think it's a coincidence. In the longer term, I don't know how the longer term, maybe you can't do, but you can make a judgment now to say that the economic benefits of Brexit that should have occurred have not. And you can also say we have an aging population, and we are going to face a choice, if we don't have significant levels of at least skilled immigration, of becoming significantly poorer, and with the younger part of our population paying very heavily to maintain an elderly population. You can do all of these things and say them without having to say which policy is right.
All of which may be true, but the question wasn't actually about Brexit. It was about climate change. But you're not going to answer it because we're going to take another question. I trust.
Since I've got the mic, I'll ask the question. Do you think the BBC sometimes responds to groups that shout loudest or make themselves heard most? And also, interested question about wokeness, metropolitan, which seem to be two sides of the other thing. It's very interesting. I mean, if you're cynical, I'm not saying I believe this, just that if you look, for instance, at diversity, it seems to be very much reflecting the diversity of the capital. Then, of course, they're saying, but what about the regions? It seems to me BBC's in a very difficult position. I don't know what they do, but sometimes I wish they stand back a bit and say, well, what exactly is diversity? What exactly are these regions? I go on and say various things. It's very interesting. If you look at something from 20 years back, 30 years back, there are issues. There are other. It's very much. There are other areas, which seem to be very much what's in vogue, and these things do change over time.
I think that's true, and I think minorities change. And I think one of the things that Channel 4, for example, needs to do is to rethink what diversity is. It's a locked-in view of diversity, I think, which is maybe 20 to 30 years out of date. But then I think the BBC also has to rethink what public service is. It's not just what it does. And increasingly, in my view, about the BBC, they're having to prepare for a commercial future, which I don't honestly care about. I don't care about commercial BBC that much, because the market's pretty effective. I care about the non-commercial element of the BBC and public service, and what's the best way to achieve public service in those times. When it goes back to the question of shouting loudest, it's more a question of visually imaginative. I mean, if you've got just think back to Fred Dibner blowing down his chimneys. Irresistible for a last item on the news. We all want to watch it. How could you refuse? As pressure groups have got more clever, they think of more ways of creating a news story. May not be loud, but it's usually visual. Are they going to throw paint on a Van Gogh, or what are they doing? Are they going to stay? There's a continued battle between pressure groups trying to create events that they feel the broadcasters have to follow, and broadcasters thinking, well, a bit like Carrot Moor in a way, it's happening, it is an event. Yeah. But is it really, what's it representative of? Of course, then you get into the argument I know some people made that a large number of anti-Brexit demonstrations in London weren't reported, despite their numbers. And those who felt passionately about that thought, look at these numbers, why are you not reporting it? But there were other demonstrations elsewhere and so on. There's always going to be that battle between very brilliant public relation people leading for a cause and trying to try to manipulate the government. But that has always gone on. It goes on with politics all the time. Why do ministers often prefer to be interviewed on the Today programme at about 6 minutes to 8? Because they know the interview can't go on more than 4 or 5 minutes, or and that's why they put weather forecasts. I say, I was going to do that in 2 minutes. I'm doing that in a minute. Do it in 30 seconds. But at least I'm there. It's a continuum. So I think you've got to be aware of it as a broadcaster and not fall into the trap. But you can't say, if an event happens and it's got a massive support, you need to report it in some form, but the prominence you give it. And the fundamental problem, as you know with news, and he knows better than I do, we do it all the time, is for everything you put in, you have to take something out.
Yeah, and also news, there is a difference in the way you approach commissioning serious programming and making decisions about what's in a news bulletin, because if you're editing a television news bulletin, pictures are important, and pictures can make a news story, and perhaps in a less obvious way, but if you're editing a radio bulletin, sounds are more important to you than they would be on television. If somebody ever invents, when I was a kid, people used to talk about inventing smell-o-vision. It hasn't happened, but if they did, then smell would be important as part of a news story, and a really smelly story would get a greater prominence on smell-o-vision than on other media. I see my old 9 o'clock news editor, Mark Dammers, at the back, sniffing at that prospect. He's a purist. I think I saw another hand shoot up. Yes, sir, at the back.
Why does the BBC constantly platform people who are opaquely funded lobbyists? It's often taken up about this, but it just goes on doing it. What I'm talking about are opaquely funded, quotes unquote, think tanks who don't do substantive research but invent talking points. Those people are constantly put up with their very vague titles and referred to as free marketeers. Most people in the audience won't know what that means. Why do they go on doing it?
We've got the message. When you use the word platform as a verb, or you mean why are these people interviewed? And
why do they get on? Look, absolute concrete example.
Yeah, but you do mean why are these people interviewed?
Why are these people
They don't present
interviewed
programmes, but they are
when
interviewed?
the audience will not understand that they are not as other men and women. They are lobbyists. They might as well be paid for advertising.
Sorry, I'm going to answer the question. I don't know why you should be answering it, but nearly everybody who appears on radio or television as an interviewee, unless they're a witness to some ghastly event, is there because they want to say something. They have a point of view, and it doesn't really matter where they come from. What I agree with you about is that if they come from an organisation, then putting up a label saying the name of the organisation isn't sufficient if audiences won't know what on earth the organisation is about and what its funding is and what its purpose is and whether it's from left, right or centre. So I think there is nobody who shouldn't be capable of being interviewed and express an opinion on the BBC. But you have to know what their bona fides are. What are they there to represent? I'm sorry to cut you short, but I realise I've got to stop in 2 minutes, and I've already said to this lady she can ask a question.
Is the concept of having to inform, educate and entertain outdated?
I don't think it's outdated, but I think parts of it are less important. This is why I do believe that the future of public service broadcasting should not be left to the BBC and should not be left to the BBC's timetable. You heard earlier them making the case that, I think, Roger, that it wasn't quite the time for a proper debate. I think the debate should start now. It's absurd to suggest that the BBC is operating in an environment remotely like the one when it was invented, when it was the only broadcaster and the only television channel. It's totally different in the last 20 years. So I think there are legitimate questions to be asked about whether, for example, the BBC should be doing things like the English. I don't know if you've watched the English and so on. What the BBC is now doing is, in my view, is taking a set of decisions without consultation, which many people would disagree with, because it's doing salami slicing, because it wishes to avoid the very, very difficult arguments about what it should or should not be doing. The answer is cut down. So you hide the cuts. BBC Radio has hidden, and Radio 4 has hidden, essentially, over the last 4 or 5 years, the nature of the cuts that have been made. And if you listen to them, you can hear less reporting, less voices, people less travelling. You've looked at what happened in local radio. I'm still not clear whether when Roger was saying the same amount of money was being spent on local radio, he meant that in real terms or not, because you'd spend the same amount of money and inflation goes up. They'll tell me whether that's true or not. But it is undeniable that local radio only works as local radio, and it will become regional radio at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and on Saturdays and some other days, it'll become national radio. Why? The BBC will always put up people like Rodri, really good, decent people to explain, but the fact is that decision has been taken because they wouldn't take other decisions. They're cutting the World Service, they're cutting local radio, they've been cutting Radio 4, they've put BBC 4 online. At which point has anybody been consulted? Now, I'm not arguing that the BBC has to consult about everything because it wouldn't get anything done. But at the very least, it should be putting out some sort of worked-through manifesto which states what it's trying to do, not hiding what it's trying to do, and have meaningful consultation. And meaningful consultation means the possibility of change. Otherwise, it's a classic BBC popular consultation in which they decide what to do, get the PR lined up, tell you what they're going to do, and do it. That's not consultation. So on the one hand, you need a decisive BBC, but on the other hand, you need one which is much more open and is honest about what's happening. And I'd say just one final thing, and it's trying to shut me up. The idea that the Labour Party, if it comes into power in 2 years' time, will massively increase spending on the BBC is for the birds.
Yeah, I think everybody recognises that. Roger is absolutely an historic part of public service broadcast journalism on British television, and we should all be grateful to him, not just for this afternoon, but for the last 60 years and for the future. Listen to his new podcast and join me in saying thank you.